Beloved community as a spiritual theme for the month has become a kind of complicated idea for me. What does beloved community even mean nowadays? Certainly it harkens back to echoes of a grand vision from the civil rights era. But more often these days, I wonder if it's even achievable in the 21st century, with so much anger and division. And we hear it used often. I have heard from some of you that it doesn't feel authentic because you don't feel it or experience it in the way you think it's meant to feel. And sometimes I wonder if any of us really do experience it in that way. I use the language of beloved community all the time. I know that you hear it. I use it to name an aspirational vision for who we are and who we say we want to be. I use it to speak the words into being as an invitation to embody it until we become it. Some social scientists might distill that practice down to fake it till you make it, which kind of works for me sometimes. The late civil rights activist, Representative John Lewis, called this practice living as if. The formation and the flourishing of this grand vision of beloved community that permeated the civil rights movement in the 60s wasn't just about creating it out there in the bigger world for other people beyond the movement. It was about living it in the movement, for the movement. For Representative Lewis, beloved community was his own practice and orientation to a world that pushed him and so many others aside. A world that inflicted pain and violence and harm. And in a sense, that practice, that living as if practice, along with the vision itself, was revolutionary. In an interview with Krista Tippett, Lewis shared his living as if framework. And he said, if you live as if you're already there, that you're already in that community, part of that sense of one family, one house, if you visualize it, if you can even have faith that it's there, for you, it's already there. And during the early days of the movement, I believed the only true and real integration for that sense of the beloved community existed within the movement itself. During that movement, beloved community arose as a vision for what was possible. As we like to say, what was possible within, among, and beyond. For the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., beloved community represented the ultimate goal of racial reconciliation and economic justice. He wrote these words in his autobiography: "The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community, so that when the battle is over, a new relationship comes into being between the oppressed and the oppressor." That is a grand, complicated vision if I ever heard one. Beloved community rises up out of this era as a significant theological ideal because it deals with ultimacy, with the meaning of community, because it's aspirational in nature, something toward which we should always strive. Lewis described that work of beloved community in the civil rights movement as a work of love. And he observed that 60 years later, few of us would use the word love to describe the movement or the work, because that word is so complicated and so layered and so removed and overused. But John Lewis reminds us that love is work and love is faith. He says it's not just something that is natural. You have to be taught the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. In the religious sense, in the moral sense, you can say that in the bosom of every human being, there is a spark of the divine. So you don't have a right as a human being to abuse that spark of the divine in a fellow human being. You don't have the right to abuse that spark of the divine in another if that's what you truly believe. For us as Unitarian Universalists, whose faith centers around work rather than belief, holding that love, that deep neighbor love, that work of love that Lewis describes at its core, beloved community becomes a foundational principle. But if I'm being honest, sometimes I wonder if beloved community is even possible. The civil rights movement made significant gains in its day, but now those gains have been pushed down and set aside yet again by systems of white supremacy with which we have never dealt with directly as a nation. We haven't dealt with it honestly and authentically with conversations about repair and reparation. When we look around at our world and culture today, the vision of beloved community disappears behind the rancor and the greed, the uncertainty and the division, behind hollow calls for unity. So what do we do? How do we still aspire, still work, still dream from the mountaintop, or even dream from the valley? It's easy to lose sight of the beloved community when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges and crises. And we begin to hear the words as trite, perhaps a bit overused, as cliched platitudes, rather than as a call for deep transformational work. Beloved community doesn't mean we all try to just get along. It's not a call for unity or even civility, because doing so disregards reality. Instead, we might consider practicing beloved community in the midst of what some scientists call contaminated diversity, recognizing the complicated ways in which life, both human and non-human, has survived and developed in the last few hundred years of human disturbance. Contaminated diversity. Our culture has conditioned us to understand progress as linear, as beneficial, as deeply individual, and best when organized into neat boxes and labels for a society created by those same systems. Even the implicit messages of a scientific academy that, according to scientist Anna Singh, centers the, quote, self-contained individual actor out to maximize personal interest and survival. Think about how much has been built upon Darwin's theory of evolution and survival of the fittest. In her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, Singh explores this idea of self-interest and contamination. She writes this: the assumption of self-containment made an explosion of new knowledge possible. Thinking through self-containment and this self-interest of individuals at whatever scale made it possible to ignore contamination. That is, transformation through encounter. So hear that definition again. Contamination is transformation through encounter. So when we have contaminated diversity, We have a multiplicity of transformations, a diverse set of transformations occurring because of our diverse encounters. Beloved community points to that transformation through encounter. Positive or negative, our lives are transformed by our encounters with others, with groups, with systems, with our earth. Beloved community invites us to consider how we show up and move through those encounters in ways that support our collective survival, not merely our individual interests. In this precarious world, replete with uncertainty, we must realize that we are vulnerable to one another, that we need each other in order to survive. We need each other and diverse communities of collaboration and the willingness to work across difference. In John Lewis's practice of nonviolence, when they would literally role play and practice those conflicted encounters before every action, they had to remind each other to practice seeing a potential attacker as once a little baby, as possessing of that divine spark, that inherent worth and dignity, despite the actions that person may have taken that put them so far off track. So, beloved community invites us to consider how we stay in community with difficult or offensive people. And by community, I mean all of them in their formations of our families, our church community, and the wider communities in which we live and work, even our nation. And there's no easy answer to this dilemma. And as I talk about it, I find myself welling up with resistance because there is so much harm and trauma that has happened in recent months and years, and even in generations. It makes thinking about the question of how to stay in community with difficult people so very hard. And my gut reaction is often, but I don't want to. And I know that wanting to or not is somewhat beside the point, that there will always be people in our midst with whom we disagree, who are difficult, who even cause us and others great harm. And we need to learn how to respond and learn how to live and learn how to collaborate and learn how to love in space together. And that's not the same as forgiving them for their wrongs or loving them in spite of their wrongs, but rather just how we embody those ideals and those spiritual practices in the midst of all of that challenge. How do we collaborate? Our Soul Matters resources remind us that to stay in community with difficult or offensive people, we have to hold on to hope. Hope that they can change and grow, hope that we can change and grow. We have to believe that their better selves exist and will eventually show up. We have to have faith that giving them the benefit of the doubt is worth it, that assuming their good intentions isn't foolish. This kind of hopefulness and generosity toward others is hard work. And embodying that hopefulness and generosity, that belovedness and assuming good intentions, does not mean that we ignore and fail to acknowledge the impact of harm when it occurs. Interrupting harm, interrupting oppression, marginalization, even that personal ouch, even when it's a well-intentioned mistake, is part of building the beloved community. It's a responsibility of the whole to center relationship over tasks and goals, over strategies and outcomes. I have a colleague who calls this holy interruption, practice that we are called to engage in over and over and over again. In a workshop I'm taking, our facilitator calls this the work of calling up rather than calling out or calling in, reminding us that when our conversations are centered in relationship, in human fallibility, and in the hope and quest for our collective liberation, that it helps us all bring the beloved community into being in each moment. The work of beloved community is bigger than we usually imagine. Perhaps not. Perhaps we know how big it is, and that's why sometimes we resist it. It's not just about building a better world, it's also about building up each other's faith. We are in a battle, not just against the division between us, but also the doubt within us. And so I'm reminded of the rabbit of our story, who seeks to understand others and the nature of God where they are at, through their eyes and experience, without having to change it or rearrange it, and allows himself to build up their faith alongside his own. The work of beloved community, the words of beloved community, are words we must speak again and again and again, so they take root in our minds and bodies and spirits. I say them over and over again. I'm willing to engage in the work, as hard as it is, over and over again, planting the work and the words as seeds of memory and future possibility for the world as it ought to be. Because the alternative is to ignore the world as it is, allowing all those systems of harm, extraction, oppression, and more to continue unchecked. The call of our Unitarian Universalist faith invites us into an imagination of building a different world, an emergent world, and into the practices and the embodiment of living as if the beloved community already exists. May it be so. Amen.